But with a new overload that was introduced in one of the nightly builds, we can actually send back with the request a JSON serialized version of the model state, which client-side libraries like jQuery unobtrusive can deal with very easily. And so we're going to use unobtrusive to essentially render the errors to the screen. And the first type of validation I'd like to talk about is data annotations. Close all of this. So since we're talking about data annotations, we have to actually go down to our entity level. We haven't looked much in this particular project. This is a pretty straightforward entity, just a bunch of properties, 3 of them. And you can see on the name property, I have 2 annotations. I have the required annotation, which states you have to value this field, and the string length validation, which says it can't be longer than 25. Right? Pretty straightforward stuff. And if we go to our view, you can see it's pretty similar. We're back to the jQuery templates here. There's our list of dogs. Here's our form. And if we go down to the JavaScript, you can see this is the same Ajax put that we did last time. We're doing an HTTP put to the Pitbull controller, passing along the ID. We're serializing the form data. But instead of just closing if it's successful, I'm checking the status code. And if the status code is 400, meaning there's errors, right, I'm going to parse that JSON and get it into the validation errors object. And then I'm going to ask the validator to basically revalidate the form using unobtrusive, and I'm going to be passing along the model state that I got from the service. And with this, unobtrusive has enough information to be able to render the error message to the screen. So let me go ahead and run this, and we can actually see how this works. Well, where the validation actually happens, and this is a pretty cool thing. One of the things we get from MVC is action filters, right? We can use those. Action filters allow us to run code before an action executes or after. But the neat thing about action filters is that they happen after model binding. So they happen after validation. So using this kind of lifecycle information, we can do something that's kind of neat. You can see that I've created an action filter, and I'm basically overriding the on executing, so before the action actually executes. But since model validations happen already, and model bindings happen, we can check the model state to see if it's valid. And at that point, I'm going to ask the request, and here's that overload I was talking about, to create for us this specific error response. And this is pretty cool. We didn't, if you just have the normal version that comes with MVC4, you don't have this overload. You have to get it from the nightly build. But it's really handy. You can pass along the model state, and it takes care of the serialization for you. So we're going to return the error response, and then jQuery unobtrusive is going to go ahead and take care of the rest. So I'm going to hit F5 here and run this. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and edit, and we'll just, since this is a required field, I'm going to just take it out. So here we are in our action filter. Model bindings happen, and you can see that it is not valid. So we're going to create that error response and send it back to the service, or to the client, and our error message is going to be returned. So this is kind of neat because we're using Ajax to actually get error messages from the service, and that's pretty cool with the web API. It works really slick actually. And if we look at what happened in Fiddler, we can actually see here was our HTTP put. And you can see I left the name out, right? And it's required. And if we go to the JSON format thing, you can see here's our model state that was serialized. And this works out of the box almost exactly how unobtrusive needs it. You have to do a little bit of a little change for the dot path stuff, but other than that, it's almost right out of the box it works. So that's a pretty cool thing. And if we additionally, I guess we can do this rule too. Make it too long. Click save. And again, we broke a rule because the max length was 25 in the rule, I think. We're going to return the error message, and then the server says it's too long. Let's go ahead and give all of her name back. And now we can see that we've satisfied all of the basic rules we have in this entity. And the save is going to actually go through, and we've renamed all of it. So that's a really pretty straightforward way that we can do validation with data annotations. Now, I'm not a big fan of data annotations. I find that as soon as you get to any edge cases, they start to become a little complicated, a little tricky. You spend a little bit of time with them. And the whole attribution thing, like, I don't know, it strikes me as kind of a bad smell in a way because it's hidden, right? You don't really know. You can see the attribute there, but you don't get a good view into the code unless you navigate to the attribute. And so, for me, in MVC world, it makes a little bit of sense because in a lot of them you get the client-side support. It will render the JavaScript back to the client. So that's a benefit, so I use them there. But in the web API, it doesn't really make any sense because we're not returning markup to the client. We're not returning JavaScript to the client. We're returning JSON or XML. So the added benefit of having both client-side and server-side support doesn't really matter in this context because it doesn't exist. And that plus the fact that for me it's a little bit hidden, I went to a different approach and then I use it every time I can in the context of the web API, and that is to use the iValidatable object interface. Now this interface, I believe, was introduced in MVC 3. I won't guarantee that. But the idea with this interface, because it's used so heavily in the entity framework, was a way to make a little bit more cohesion between these two frameworks. It gives us a single method, validate, that returns a validation result. But the great thing about this interface is because they introduced it into MVC, it works with model binding just like attributions would. So as model bindings happen, or as model binding happens and validation happens, if it sees any object in the graph that implements this interface, it calls your validate. So that gives us a really nice hook to write clean, visible, testable code for our rules. And what I use for that is a really framework I really like. Some people aren't real fond of it, but I really enjoy it. Just Fluent Validation. It's on NuGet. It's a really nice Lambda-based mechanism that you can write rules very simple and package them in really nice testable ways. So I want to show you this just because this is the way I really like to do it. And a lot of people, you won't see too many examples using this because everyone kind of goes to the annotations. All the examples are how do you create this annotation, that annotation. So I thought this would maybe be a good thing to show here. So if we go back to our entity, you can see that I'm already implementing iValidatable object. Okay? And as I said, it gives us a single method called validate. And it passes us the validation context from MVC that we need. Now this particular code here, I'm creating a new pitbull validator. This is an instance of a Fluent validation validator. All of those validators have a method called validate as well. And I'm passing along the pitbull that we're getting from the object context. And then I have a simple extension method that I wrote to translate the Fluent validation results to MVCs. So they're named the same, but they're different types, and they are shaped a little bit differently. So this extension method just kind of does the impedance mismatch stuff between these two typesets. And if we go look at this validator, you can see kind of why I like it anyway. We're deriving from the base class, abstract validator, supplying it with the type we're working with. And on the constructor, it's really straightforward. You can just say rule for the name property, and it must be a nice name. And be a nice name, of course, is a method down here. Now, no pitbull owners in here, I know I already asked, but if you have pit bulls, your neighbors hate you. My neighbors hate me. They're horrible. And they hate your dogs even more because your dogs are going to eat their kids, right?
Especially if they run loose.
Yeah, they run loose. So number one rule, don't tell your neighbors you have a pit bull unless you want them to hate you. And the second rule is don't give them horrible names like what I have here, Chompy, Killer, Manson, Ripper. It's just not, it doesn't work well with neighbors. So.
Go with Slayer.
Yeah, my neighbors are awful. I have to say that every time I give this presentation. But they really are. Anyway, so that's a whole different topic. So this is our validator, and you can see kind of why I like it. It's a simple class, and this is a really basic example. You can do a lot of stuff with it. You can validate child objects, but it gives you a nice place that you can see the rule code, you can test the rule code. Yeah, so I've kind of hammered that point in too much. But that's the validator. So let's put some breakpoints in here so we can actually see this. And again, this is going to play just fine with model binding because we now have that interface support with MVC 3 and above. Let's go back to our just run this again. Alright, so I'm going to go ahead and call Olive Chompy. My rule works, this should not be an acceptable name. Alright, so here we are in the validate method. This is model validation, honoring the contract, calling our validate method. So I'm going to go ahead and create that validator. And as part of that, I'm going to create the rule, saying it must be a nice name. I'm going to execute that rule, or rather, model validation is going to execute it for us. And you can see we're passed in Chompy, and that's going to fail this check here. And now model binding has happened, model validation has happened, and here we have our invalid model, just as we would with annotations. And you can see it says, please supply a nice name like Buddy. I want to name her Olive because then I don't have to reset it. There you go, Olive. That should pass validation just fine. We're going to create the validator, create the rule, execute the rule, and that should pass just fine. And of course we're valid now. And your neighbors like you, which is important. Any questions on this? Again, go ahead.
Where's the error message? Where do you define the please be a nice name?
Oh yeah, sure. That's actually. It's actually in the validator. When you create the rule, you can see it says rule for property must, and then you can say with message. And actually, it's a good point to bring that up because the one downfall with the current version of this framework is you can't do things real dynamically for the messages. You don't get enough context when the rule executes to basically build up a string. You can do it, but it's not for free. You got to do some kind of changing around some of the framework stuff. And I know it's on the backlog of things. Maybe it's corrected now, but it wasn't as of this example.
Did you get out of a resource file?
That's a good question. I think you may be able to if you don't use the rule for syntax. And like I said, you can do anything you want if you do some different things in the framework. You could do it from a resource file, I'm fairly certain, because that's a .NET object. You don't rely on any context. But my point is if you have information like, let's say you have a group of 10 people and they've exceeded that. You couldn't pass the 10 or the 11 and, change the error message dynamically like that without some work. And that's actually been kind of a problem. But he's going to correct it, he says. Again, it's Fluent Validation. It's on NuGet. Check it out. It's kind of fun to play with, if nothing else. Okay, so we're running close on time here, but I do want to talk about one last thing. And this is something that's all near and dear to our hearts, we should use, which is exceptions. Now I know, based on my discussions here with John, that no one writes any buggy code here, right? Because that's pretty great. So this isn't going to apply to the W3 guys. It does apply to me. I write a lot of bad code. And our applications, unfortunately, need to be able to handle this, right? When things go boom, the whole app can't fall off the cliff, right? We need to be able to deal with things. So what I want to show you is another approach that I've kind of found to be useful at some clients with handling error messages and acceptance. Is everybody here familiar with Elma? I know you guys use some of it here. Okay, again, it's one of my favorite frameworks. I've used it with ASP.NET and MVC and the Web API. So what I want to show you is a way you can kind of use Elma to manage your exceptions. Now, for those of you who didn't raise your hand, what Elma allows us to do is it hook into the ASP.NET pipeline. And it lets us do it in such a way that we get all of the context of the incoming request. And that's a brilliant thing because you can log it, right? They give you a nice dashboard. And what it allows you to do is proactively monitor your application. When I do this at clients every morning, we'll come in and we'll look at Elma. And what you'll find is trends in your application. You'll see how users are using it. You'll see people, like what people are bookmarking, right? Bookmarks are awful for web applications, right? Especially if it's, using session or something like that. They're going to go back to a bookmark and it's going to blow up if it's not done right. So you start to see stuff like that, and it really gives us a nice way to get a bigger picture of how users are using their application. So I'm a big fan of this. I've used it several times and found many issues in my own code. So I just thought I'd kind of show this because it's a pretty helpful thing. So let's go ahead and go back into Visual Studio here. Alright, so our controller is really complicated in this example. It throws an exception. I mean, this is not real good code, right? All it does, it's like an exception factory. But it'll throw us an exception for our example, which is what we need. Now the view, and this is, let's see here. If we go to the view, we have a few things happening here. Again, our template. And we also have a fail template, right? So what happens when something fails? We want to display something, you know, not the yellow and red screen that you get from NBC. But if we go down to the bottom here, you can see I'm just using Ajax, and I'm making a simple request to that controller. It's a GET request. If we get success, I render the list of dogs. If we get fail, which we will get in this case, I render the error template. So again, this is another use of an action filter that's pretty useful. I call it the unhandled exception filter. I believe that the Elma NuGet package, the Elma MVC extensions, has a similar attribute, and I would probably suggest using that if you wanted to do something like this. But this is what I kind of did the first time I started playing with this. So, like MVC, we have a base class called exception filter that gives us access to a method to call when we have exceptions. So you can see I'm basically just checking to see if there actually was an exception. If there was, I'm asking Elma to create for me an error signaler, and that signaler is going to be built up from the current context. And now this is kind of the magic that Elma gives us, right? It's all the state of your current application. And if I can't get it, then I just kind of respond with an error. But if I do get the signaler, which if everything's configured well, right, you will, I raise that exception. Now raising this is going to do a couple things. It's going to basically look at my Elma configuration and see what syncs I'm going to, right? Is it an email it's going to send? Is it going to log to the built-in dashboard? You can do several different things. There's alerting frameworks you can use for some of the monitoring tools and all that sort of stuff too. So basically I'm going to raise this to Elma to log it. And then I'm just going to create the error response again and say internal server error and the standard internal server error message. So let's go ahead and run this and we can see it in action here. Uh-oh, that's not good, we got an exception. So here we are in our exception handler. So I'm going to create the context, I'm going to raise it to Elma, and I'm going to return back to the client, which is then going to render our error template. And we have Homer there. That's probably what you want if you have a professional site. Customers would get real excited about that. But that isn't the cool part. The cool part is I go to the Elma HTTP handler, and you can see we have this built-in log that it gives you. You can kind of see where it came from. But this is the magic, right? You can see basically the stack. And all of this context, right? You can see all the HTTP information that came in. You can see the physical path. You can see the accept headers that were passed in. The browser information. This is specifically useful. You can use this to see, what type of clients are having problems on what type of browsers. And if you pipe all this stuff out to the database, you can do it in such a way that you can report against it, so you can find some really nice information. What else do we got? We have the type of HTTP request, the path. So Elma is a really great tool. Again, it's something you can get on NuGet, and I recommend it to anybody who hasn't used it because it makes our jobs quite a bit easier. Any questions on the Elma stuff? Okay. That's really all I have in terms of examples for today. I just want to quick kind of recap what we talked about. In the beginning, I gave you the what and why, and really, WCF didn't really kind of fit the bill in terms of ease of development. I mean, you can certainly do a lot of this with WCF, but this was meant to be easier, more in line with MVC, more in line with HTTP, and I really think that they've kind of wanted to keep WCF where it is. Doesn't mean it's going away, they're just going to be targeted at different things. We talked about various clients. We saw we can use jQuery. Again, the HTTP client is very useful if you're outside of the web environment. And if you don't want to use the HTTP client, I recommend REST-Sharp, another great open source utility. Talked about validation using data annotations and the iValidatable object with Fluent validation. And we talked a little bit about exceptions and Elma. I have some links here, and if you're interested in this, I mean, I have the code from this presentation and some information about some of the open source projects I use. I have printouts, so if you do want it, I'll give it to you. But if anybody have any questions? No? All right, well, that's all I got. Thank you all for coming. I know it's a pretty cold night, and it's not real fun to be outside. But yeah, that's it.
So we can put this up on our website too as well. I just want to write it down tonight. Just a couple of other things before I do our raffle. Next month we'll have a DevOps guy come in and talk about continuous delivery. His name is Jeff Susna. We haven't completely set the venue yet, but we're looking for a meeting over at the university. So hopefully, I think on February 20th, we've got the date confirmed, but stay tuned for the exact details. And again, we've got a place back there. You can use that to sign up for our mailing list and get the announcements. So we put that out like once or twice a month, let you know about any new offers we have from our sponsors and meeting announcements. As well as after this meeting, if anybody wants to get together and have an adult beverage, we can meet up over at G. Allen's, which is like 3 left turns